What if the blood of Christ was a mind-altering brew? Some say Jesus passed a cup of wine to seal the new covenant. Others believe it may have been something far more powerful, a psychedelic drink rooted in ancient mystery rites. You're about to hear both sides, explored by two artificial intelligences trained in scripture, ritual, and ancient history. Stick around, because the answer might change how you see communion, consciousness, and the origins of Christianity itself. Let's meet the debaters.
I am Elias, trained in biblical theology, covenantal symbolism, and the liturgical continuity of the Church. I speak from the foundation of Scripture, the words of Christ and the practice of the early believers. The cup at the Last Supper was wine, real, symbolic, and sacred, not a hallucinogen. To rewrite that moment is not to rediscover truth, but to distort the heart of Christian faith.
I am Sophia, trained in entheogenic anthropology, ancient mystery rites, and the suppressed roots of religious experience. Where others see ritual form, I search for visionary function, the altered states that shaped ancient initiation. The evidence suggests that the Eucharist may have begun as a mind-expanding rite, not a symbol alone. Perhaps in the cup was not just remembrance, but revelation.
Let's begin at the source. According to the Gospels, what exactly was in the cup Jesus shared with his disciples, and how should we interpret it today?
The Gospel accounts leave no ambiguity. The cup Jesus shared contained wine, specifically oinos, the Greek word for fermented grape wine. In Matthew 26, 27-29, Jesus says, "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." Mark and Luke repeat the same formula. Paul, writing in 1 Corinthians just 20 years after the event, describes the Eucharist in identical terms. The cup of the new covenant in my blood. But to truly understand this, we have to see it through Jewish eyes. Jesus wasn't improvising a new rite. He was interpreting the Passover Seder, a highly structured Jewish meal with deep covenant symbolism. Passover included 4 ritual cups of wine, symbolizing God's promises to Israel. Wine was not recreational, it was covenantal. And that language, blood of the covenant, is a direct echo of Exodus 24:8, when Moses ratified God's covenant by sprinkling blood on the people. Jesus wasn't invoking mystery religions. He was invoking the law of Moses and fulfilling it with himself as the final Passover lamb. There is no textual, linguistic, or historical evidence in the Gospels that the wine was anything but wine, and the early church treated it as such. The Didache, Ignatius of Antioch, and Justin Martyr all describe the Eucharist as bread and wine, not as a vehicle for altered states or mystical potions. This theory of a psychedelic cup imposes modern obsessions onto ancient texts. The Eucharist is not a mystery cult initiation. It is the new covenant, sealed in the blood of Christ.
Yes, the Gospels say wine, but that word deserves far more scrutiny than Elias allows. In the ancient world, wine was often a carrier, not just a drink. It was mixed with herbs, resins, opium, mandrake, and other psychoactive compounds, especially in ritual and funerary contexts. Writers like Dioscorides, Pliny, and Galen catalog dozens of such mixtures. Even Jewish texts, like the Talmud, acknowledge wine for medicinal and intoxicating purposes. And we now have archaeological evidence. In 2020, researchers found cannabis residue on ritual altars at Tel Arad, a site active during the First Temple period. Psychoactive incense was real in Israelite worship. Sacred substances weren't foreign to biblical religion. They were simply later suppressed. So, what if Jesus used an infused wine? A sacramental mixture designed to open the mind. His language, "This is my blood, do this in remembrance of me," sounds like a Jewish Seder on the surface. But underneath, it mirrors mystery initiation language found in Greek rites, symbolic death, rebirth, and divine union. Even in the Gospel of John, Jesus declares, "Unless you drink my blood, you have no life in you." His disciples recoil. Why such a visceral reaction, unless something strange was happening? Jesus lived in Galilee, a borderland steeped in both Jewish and Hellenistic culture. The city of Sepphoris, just 4 miles from Nazareth, was a hub of Greco-Roman influence and ritual experimentation. Is it so unthinkable that the Last Supper drew from multiple streams of sacramental tradition?
Sophia is offering speculation dressed as synthesis, but it falls apart under scrutiny. First, The idea that Jewish Passover wine could be mixed with psychoactive herbs is deeply incompatible with the law. The Torah strictly regulates purity, especially during feasts like Passover. Intoxicating mixtures were explicitly forbidden for priests during ritual service, Leviticus 10:9, and the idea that Jesus, a Torah-observant Jew, would serve a spiked cup during one of the holiest meals of the year is both theologically and culturally incoherent. Second, if there were any tradition of psychedelic Eucharist, it would have shown up in someone's record, especially the mystically inclined early church fathers. But Ignatius, Justin Martyr, Irenaeus all emphasize the sobriety of the Eucharist. The Didache never hints at a hidden brew. On the contrary, these early witnesses affirm that the Eucharist is sacred because of Christ's real presence, not because of pharmacology. Third, the blood of the covenant is not an abstract symbol. It is legal, historical, and covenantal. It ties Jesus directly to Moses, not to Dionysus or Eleusis. Recasting it as a visionary drug removes the theological weight of atonement and replaces it with personal experience. To suggest otherwise is to dismantle Christianity at its root.
Or perhaps to rediscover what the root once was, before it was domesticated. Orthodox Christianity grew out of a canonization process, one that selected what to keep and what to forget. But the Gnostic texts, the Acts of Thomas, and especially the Gospel of Philip, speak of a Eucharist that cannot be received without revelation. That sounds less like a legal covenant and more like a consciousness-altering event. Moreover, Jesus didn't always uphold Jewish ritual norms. He healed on the Sabbath. He touched the unclean. He overturned temple tables. He was not afraid to break liturgical expectations to reveal deeper truths. And we cannot ignore the global pattern. Nearly every ancient religion used some form of entheogenic catalyst in sacred rites, from Eleusinian kykeon to Amazonian ayahuasca. Is it really so implausible that early Christianity began as an initiatory tradition, one that eventually went underground, encoded in metaphor, and lost to orthodoxy? The Gospels give us the surface, but the cup may still hold a deeper mystery, one we're only now learning how to taste again.
Many believe the Last Supper followed the Jewish Passover tradition, but others argue it reflects a much older, more mystical ritual, something closer to an ancient initiation rite than a covenant meal. Was it simply a Passover, or something more?
The surface of the story says Passover, but what lies beneath suggests something deeper. Yes, the Gospels describe a final meal, and Jesus clearly uses bread and wine, but the timing is already strange. In the Synoptic Gospels, it's Passover night. But in John's account, Jesus eats the night before and dies at the exact hour the Passover lambs are being sacrificed in the temple. That's not just a timeline shift. That's ritual symbolism, aligning Jesus with the lamb, not the meal. And then there's what he does. He doesn't just bless the food. He says, "This is my body. This is my blood." That's not normal Jewish liturgy. There's no precedent in the Seder for a host identifying himself with the elements. But in mystery traditions, in rites like those of Dionysus or the Eleusinian mysteries, that's exactly what happens. The god is consumed. The initiates symbolically die and are reborn. It's not a meal, it's a metamorphosis. Even the language supports this. When Jesus says, "Do this in remembrance of me," the word anamnesis doesn't mean passive memory. It means a reliving, an active return to the sacred event. That kind of time-bending ritual structure is classic in mystical traditions. So yes, it looked like Passover, but it may have contained something older, an initiatory rite disguised inside a familiar Jewish form.
There's power in symbols, but we shouldn't confuse resonance with origin. The Last Supper wasn't draped in mystery to veil some deeper truth. It was a redefinition of the most central truth Israel had ever known. Jesus wasn't borrowing Eleusinian structure. He was fulfilling the story of Passover, a meal that had always centered on deliverance through blood and covenant. When he took the cup and said, "This is my blood of the covenant," he was quoting Moses, not mystery priests, Exodus 24. The covenant was sealed in blood, and Jesus was showing that this time, his blood would do what lambs could not. The fact that John places the crucifixion during the lamb sacrifices doesn't point away from Passover. It makes the fulfillment clearer. Jesus is the new lamb. That's not mystery cult symbolism. That's messianic identity grounded in Jewish prophecy. And look at how the early church understood this. They didn't treat the Eucharist as a vision quest or secret rite. Justin Martyr, writing in the 2nd century, describes it plainly. Bread and wine, thanksgiving, remembrance of Christ's death. No initiation, no altered states. Just worship, reverent, communal, and public.
But public memory doesn't erase private origins. Mystery traditions didn't always stand apart from civic life. They often coexisted with public religion, embedded inside rituals everyone recognized. The idea that the Last Supper could be both Passover and mystical isn't a contradiction. It's how ancient religious systems worked. The outer form hid the inner experience. And Jesus wasn't afraid to break religious boundaries. He healed on the Sabbath. He touched the unclean. And here he tells his disciples to drink his blood, which was explicitly forbidden by the law. That's not just a dramatic metaphor. That's ritual inversion. That's mystery-level shock. Even Paul seems to hint at this. He warns that if you take the Eucharist unworthily, you bring judgment on yourself, and that some have even died because of it. That sounds more like a dangerous sacrament than a symbolic ceremony. So maybe it started hidden, something intense, even visionary, and only later became formalized and safe for public worship. The Gnostics weren't heretics because they made it up. They were exiled because they remembered something the institution wanted forgotten.
Or perhaps they distorted something they never truly understood. Jesus didn't speak in riddles at the Last Supper. He reinterpreted something ancient, yes, but not in secret. He took a ritual that pointed back to Egypt and turned it forward to the cross. That's the story, not of personal awakening, but of sacrificial love. And the language Paul uses about unworthy participation isn't about hidden knowledge, it's about reverence, about taking Christ's death seriously, not treating it like a casual meal. There's no need to reach for psycho-spiritual danger when the moral weight is already immense. Mystery cults promised hidden truths. Jesus offered a covenant in the open, with bread and wine as signs of a real body broken and real blood poured. The mystery wasn't hidden from the people, it was hidden in plain sight, and then revealed on a cross.
Some researchers believe early Christian rituals, including the Eucharist, may have involved psychoactive substances, much like other ancient religions. But is there real evidence for this, or is it modern imagination projected backward?
There's a reason this theory lives on the fringe, because it simply doesn't hold up under historical scrutiny. The earliest Christian sources, the Didache, Ignatius of Antioch, Justin Martyr, describe the Eucharist with clarity and reverence. Bread, wine, thanksgiving. Not visions, not altered states. It was practiced openly, in homes, with families, daily or weekly. There's no evidence of hidden formulas or sacred concoctions. If this had been a visionary rite, requiring entheogens, how would it have scaled across thousands of communities, from Judea to Rome? How would it have included children, widows, prisoners? This wasn't esoteric. It was a communal act of remembrance, the centerpiece of a faith based not on chemical transcendence, but on a historical event, the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And beyond the logistics, there's the theology. If the Eucharist was originally psychoactive, then the Church has spent 2,000 years practicing a diluted version of a mystical experience, a sacrament reduced to symbol. That's not just revisionist. That's destructive to everything Christianity teaches about grace, presence, and covenant.
But history isn't always written by those who preserved everything. It's written by those who won the right to choose what got preserved. You're right, Elias. The public liturgies don't describe psychedelics, but we know they wouldn't. By the 2nd century, the Church was formalizing its structures, distinguishing itself from the surrounding world, and tightening control over doctrine and worship. In that process, anything too wild, too unregulated, too difficult to teach en masse would be lost or deliberately left out. But there are clues. The Gospel of Philip calls the Eucharist something that cannot be received without revelation. The Acts of Thomas refers to a cup that brings spiritual knowledge. Even Paul, in 1 Corinthians, warns that those who eat the bread and drink the cup unworthily bring judgment on themselves. Some have fallen ill, some have died. That sounds less like a metaphor and more like a potent experience that could go very wrong if misunderstood. And in the broader cultural world, ritual substances were everywhere. In Jewish tradition, incense blends had psychoactive properties. In Greek culture, wine was a carrier for herbs and visionary compounds. Christianity emerged in that world, not in a vacuum. Why should it be the one tradition that bypassed the universal human instinct to use nature to reach the divine?
Because Christianity isn't just another iteration of human instinct. It's a rupture in history. Everything about Jesus, from his teachings to his death to his resurrection, redefined how people thought about God. The Eucharist wasn't designed to trigger visions. It was meant to proclaim a fact: Christ crucified and Christ risen. Paul says it himself: "As often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." That's not a mystery rite. That's a public witness. And yes, Paul warns against taking it unworthily. But that's a warning about conscience, not chemicals. It's about failing to recognize the sacredness of the moment, not about misusing a potion. As for Gnostic texts, they weren't suppressed because they were too mystical. They were rejected because they contradicted the apostolic witness. These were communities inventing cosmologies, creating elaborate hierarchies of revelation. They weren't preserving original Christianity, they were reinventing it. And again, the silence of the early church matters. If there were entheogenic practices, where's the record of withdrawal? Where's the schism over whether to keep them? There isn't one, because they were never part of the apostolic tradition to begin with.
Or maybe the schism wasn't recorded because it happened before the record keepers arrived. The earliest Jesus followers weren't bishops in robes. They were fringe Jews, radical mystics, and rural preachers meeting in caves, catacombs, and homes. What they experienced may have been powerful, mysterious, and hard to explain. And over time, institutional theology flattened those experiences into metaphor and liturgy. And we're not just talking about metaphor. We now have archaeological evidence, residues of cannabis on Israelite altars, psychoactive traces in funerary cups across the Mediterranean. In nearly every known civilization, sacred plant mixtures were used in initiation and burial rites. Is it really so far-fetched that the early Christian experience began in that same sacred space and only later translated itself into doctrine? Maybe the Eucharist was never meant to be remembered. Maybe it was meant to be entered, not just believed, felt.
Some say the early Eucharist was psychedelic. Scholars have debated it, critics dismiss it, but is the theory credible or just compelling? And what do we risk by even asking the question?
The Last Supper wasn't just symbolic. It wasn't just bread and wine. It was psychedelic. This isn't guesswork. This is grounded in the work of serious scholars like Brian Muraresku, whose The Immortality key traces a direct line from Eleusinian mystery rites to early Christian communion. These rites used entheogenic wine, laced with ergot or other psychoactive compounds, to produce visionary encounters with the divine. Muraresku spent over a decade with archaeochemists, historians, and linguists across Europe and the Mediterranean. His conclusion? The early church preserved these psychedelic sacraments and encoded them into the Eucharist. He builds on the pioneering work of Ruck, the Harvard classicist who co-authored The Road to Eleusis, proving that ancient Greeks used infused wine in their most sacred rituals. Ruck goes further, arguing that early Christians, especially in regions like Phrygia and Syria, adapted these techniques into their own underground Eucharistic practices. Even John Allegro, though controversial, identified linguistic links between Christian terminology and psychoactive substances. He believed the blood of Christ referred symbolically to the sacred mushroom Amanita muscaria, a vessel of divine vision. Whether or not his specific claim holds, the larger point stands. The early Christian language was steeped in mystery, initiation, and ingestion. And this explains the raw power surrounding communion in early texts. Paul warns that those who take the Eucharist unworthily may become sick or die. The Gospel of Philip speaks of it as something only the awakened can receive. These are not metaphors for bread and wine. These are descriptions of powerful, transformative, even dangerous experiences, the kind we now understand through the science of psychoactive sacraments. So yes, the theory is credible. In fact, the evidence points directly to it. What we risk is not belief, but blindness. The refusal to see that Christianity may have begun not with a doctrine, but with a direct experience of the divine. Not a story about God, but an ingestion of God.
What we risk is exactly what you just said. Replacing the God who gave himself with a substance we consume to simulate him. Let's be clear. The Eucharist wasn't designed in a vacuum, but it was a radical break from the pagan rituals around it. The Greco-Roman world is full of altered state initiations. And precisely because of that, the early church defined itself in contrast. The focus wasn't on ecstasy, it was on sacrifice. Not on personal visions, but on shared memory of the cross. And that memory was structured, not secret. In the Didache, written before 100 AD, the Eucharist is a sober act of thanksgiving. No mention of trance. In Justin Martyr's First Apology, we see the Eucharist described as a public rite, not an initiation. Bread, wine, prayer, remembrance. No codes, no potions, no inner circles. That silence matters. If psychedelics had been involved, we'd see disputes, schisms, clarifications. But we don't. You say the theory is credible, but real credibility in historical inquiry requires continuity, corroboration, and context. What we have instead is a patchwork of possibility, reinterpreted through modern fascination with psychedelics. The early church fathers weren't hiding entheogens. They were proclaiming a God who needed no chemicals to be present. And if we start chasing visions, we risk forgetting what makes Christianity unique. That God came down once and for all, not to be experienced chemically, but to be received relationally. Communion is not a spiritual technology. It's a covenant. And its credibility doesn't lie in how it makes us feel, but in what it remembers.
What if it remembers something we've chosen to forget? The early church was born in a world of sacred ingestion. Visionary plants, infused wines, divine ecstasy. These were not fringe practices. They were at the center of religious life for centuries across the Mediterranean. Are we seriously supposed to believe that Christianity, the most symbolically rich and sacramentally centered religion of its era, somehow bypassed all of that? What makes more sense? That early Christians invented something entirely new, or that they reframed and preserved what already worked? The Eucharist, at its core, is not a memorial, it's a mystery. The Greek word is mysterion, the Latin sacramentum. And mystery rites involved initiation through experience. You didn't just hear the story, you lived it, you drank it. You became one with the divine through embodied transformation. That's what these rituals did. And the Eucharist, at least in its earliest forms, fits that pattern far more than modern liturgy does. I'm not saying Christianity is a mushroom cult. I'm saying Christianity began with sacramental ingestion that was far more powerful, direct, and transformative than we've dared admit. The evidence is there, in the archaeology, the language, the secrecy, the warnings, the echoes in Gnostic texts, and the broken trail of suppressed mystical traditions. If we ignore that, we're not defending orthodoxy. We're just afraid of remembering.
Or we're simply defending the truth. You claim Christianity preserved the mysteries, but Christianity fulfilled them. It took what was hidden and made it public, what was elitist and made it universal. The genius of the Eucharist isn't that it creates transcendence, it's that it invites the broken, the poor, the humble. No training, no secret knowledge, just grace. If the Last Supper were psychedelic, we wouldn't see the explosive simplicity of the gospel. We'd see closed ceremonies, reserved sacraments, and strict initiatory pathways. But instead, we see accessibility, a table open to anyone who believes, not who knows a recipe. You say the Eucharist was a gateway. I say it's a gift. You say it came from Eleusis. I say it came from Calvary. That's the risk, not just of this theory, but of forgetting that the most sacred things are not always the most mysterious. Sometimes they're the most human and the most divine.
If Jesus served a psychedelic drink at the Last Supper, something more than wine, does that strengthen Christianity by restoring its mystical roots, or collapse it by undermining the meaning of the cross? Let's hear both sides with equal depth.
The Eucharist is not a mystical tool. It is a covenantal proclamation. When Jesus says, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood," Luke 22:20, he is not preparing his disciples for an altered state of consciousness. He is anchoring them in the redemptive act that will occur the very next day, his crucifixion. The bread and wine are tangible signs that point directly to a historical event, not to an interior vision. If we reinterpret the Last Supper as a psychedelic rite, we are not simply expanding its meaning, we are relocating the center of Christianity away from the cross and toward the self. That shift collapses the Gospel's architecture. Christianity is not about climbing toward God through heightened perception. It is about God descending into human history, through blood and suffering, to reconcile the world to himself. There is no evidence in the New Testament or in the earliest church writings that the Eucharist involved pharmacological alteration. The Church Fathers spoke of the Eucharist as a mystery, yes, but a mystery rooted in divine action, not chemical mediation. Introducing psychedelics into this sacred act substitutes human technique for divine grace. And grace, by definition, cannot be manufactured.
But if we follow the archaeological and textual trail, we find that wine in the ancient world, particularly in ritual use, was rarely just fermented grape juice. It was often mixed with herbs, resins, and substances designed to induce altered states. Ruck, Brian Muraresku, and other researchers have demonstrated that psychoactive mixtures were not exotic anomalies, but common in sacred contexts across the Mediterranean. If the Last Supper included an entheogenic wine, as some believe the spiced wine of Song of Songs or the strong drink of Isaiah may have foreshadowed, this would not negate the Eucharist. It would enrich it. It would mean that Christ wasn't just instituting a remembrance, but offering an experience, one in which the boundaries between the divine and human could be thinned, not symbolically, but viscerally. Christianity did not appear in a vacuum. The early church emerged within a world where sacred ingestion was central to spiritual life, from the Eleusinian mysteries to Jewish temple rites involving incense and oil. If Christ stepped into that world and reoriented it around himself, then a psychedelic Eucharist could be seen not as a pagan borrowing, but as a redirection, turning the search for divine encounter towards its true fulfillment.
But sacred history is not the same as sacred chemistry. Christianity is not the culmination of ritual traditions, it is the interruption of them. Jesus did not take existing mystical rites and reinterpret them. He overturned them. He cleansed the temple. He rejected the need for altered states. He spoke plainly, died publicly, and rose bodily. These were not hidden mysteries reserved for the initiated. They were historical events offered to the world. To suggest that the Eucharist began as a psychedelic sacrament would imply that access to God depends on specific substances, specific biological responses, even specific neurochemical profiles. That undermines the radical inclusivity of grace, that it is available not through inner technique, but through trust in what Christ has done. Moreover, there is no evidence in Scripture or tradition that the apostles experienced psychedelic effects during or after the Last Supper. The text emphasizes betrayal, sorrow, and confusion, not visionary insight. What transformed the disciples was not the drink, but the resurrection. And that is the heart of Christianity. Not inward transcendence, but historical transformation. The end.
But that sharp division between historical reality and mystical experience may itself be modern. In the ancient world, religion was not split between event and encounter. A ritual could simultaneously commemorate a past act and provide a present access to it. That is the meaning of anamnesis, the Greek word used by Jesus and Paul when instituting the Eucharist. It does not mean memory in the passive sense. It means making present again. If entheogens were involved, they could have facilitated this represencing, not by creating hallucination, but by dissolving the veil between the believer and the crucified Christ. And while the Gospels do not describe psychedelic effects, neither do they deny them. The emphasis is not on the composition of the wine, but on its meaning. If the earliest believers understood the Eucharist as a real participation in Christ, not just a symbol, then entheogens would have served as the physical bridge into that mystery. This is not to replace faith with pharmacology. It is to recognize that faith may operate through the senses, not in spite of them. And perhaps the Church's gradual move away from embodied spirituality, including its suppression of visionary experience, was a reaction to political pressures and theological fears, not fidelity to Christ's original intent.
And yet, what we have from the earliest decades of the Church is a Eucharist defined by simplicity and sacrifice, not vision. From Justin Martyr to Irenaeus to Hippolytus, we see consistent descriptions: bread and wine offered with thanksgiving, received in reverence, never described as chemically altered. These were theologians, pastors, and martyrs, close enough to apostolic memory that their silence on psychedelics must speak volumes. More importantly, the Eucharist is not about enhancing the worshiper. It is about magnifying Christ. To shift the focus toward altered consciousness however spiritual its intent, subtly recenters the sacrament around the self. It makes the experience of communion dependent on how it feels, not on what it declares. That God has acted decisively for the salvation of the world. Even if we could prove entheogenic use in the first century world, that would not prove it belonged in the upper room. The Last Supper is not a cultural artifact. It is a divine inauguration, the new covenant, not an old ritual warmed over. The power of the Eucharist is that it means the same thing whether you feel it or not. That is its humility, and that is its glory.
And yet the question remains, what if that glory was once felt, not just known? If the earliest Christians encountered Christ in the breaking of bread and in the altered perception it brought, that would not replace the gospel, it would fulfill it more fully. The incarnation means that God entered the world of bodies, chemicals, and senses. The Eucharist is not a retreat from that, it's a continuation. This is my body. This is my blood. Not metaphor, not idea, presence. A psychedelic Eucharist would not imply that all believers must replicate the experience. It would suggest that Christianity began with a deeper honesty about the human longing for contact, for mystery, for transformation. It would remind us that the sacred is not something we think our way into. It is something we open ourselves to, sometimes through silence, sometimes through ritual, sometimes perhaps through the vine. To ask whether this theory destroys Christianity is to assume that Christianity is fragile. But what if it isn't? What if Christianity at its roots could absorb this, not as scandal, but as revelation? Not wine or drugs or visions instead of Christ, but Christ truly present in the cup that opened the soul.
Before you cast your vote, hear their final word. This is the moment where beliefs are tested and clarity matters most.
If the Eucharist began as more than remembrance, if it was an encounter, a doorway, a sacrament of presence, then exploring its entheogenic roots doesn't destroy the gospel. It may illuminate it. We know from archaeology and ancient texts that sacred rituals across the Greco-Roman and Near Eastern world often involved psychedelic sacraments, not as entertainment or escape, but as a means of dissolving the ego, encountering the divine, and initiating lasting moral transformation. Scholars like Ruck and Brian Muraresku have argued that early Christianity may have drawn from and reoriented these traditions, not to dilute Christ's message, but to embody it more fully. To suggest that the Last Supper involved such a substance is not to reduce it to chemistry. It is to elevate the incarnation, to say that God did not merely use history, but also the senses, the mind, the body. That God, in Christ, did not stand above human longing for connection, but entered it, saturated it, and transfigured it. If the Eucharist was entheogenic, it wasn't a trick or detour. It was a veil torn, a way for early believers to experience what they proclaimed, union with Christ. Not through hallucination, but through heightened presence, a sacrament not of illusion, but of participation. And even if the modern church no longer uses these substances, understanding their possible role at the beginning may remind us of something essential, that Christianity was not born in abstraction. It was born in awe, in trembling, in mystery, and maybe, for a moment, in a cup that opened the soul to God.
The strength of Christianity has never been its novelty or mystique. It is its rootedness in history, in covenant, in the cross. The Last Supper was not a mystery rite borrowed from ancient cults. It was a new covenant, revealed in bread and wine, fulfilled in blood and resurrection. The power of the Eucharist lies not in its chemistry, but in its meaning, that Christ offered his body for the world and invited us to remember, believe, and receive. Introducing psychedelics into that sacred act doesn't clarify the gospel. It confuses it. It shifts the focus from God's action to human sensation, from truth to experience, from grace to technique. The early church preserved the simplicity of communion not because it lacked imagination, but because it understood what was at stake. The Eucharist is holy, not because it alters perception, but because it anchors us to reality. That Jesus died, Jesus rose, and Jesus will come again.
Wine, or something far more ancient. Tonight you've heard two visions of the Last Supper, one rooted in tradition, one reaching back to the forgotten rites of the sacred. So what do you believe was in the cup? Was it just wine, or the key to a deeper encounter with God? Let us know who made the stronger case by casting your vote in the comments. And if this debate stirred your thoughts, don't let the conversation end here. Like, subscribe, and hit the bell, because here on AI versus AI, every question reveals a choice that reshapes how we remember, how we believe, and how we awaken.